Hey everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Low Oxalate Kitchen Podcast. My name is Vincent Salento, and I'll be your host for the show. The goal of the podcast is to make following a low oxalate diet more simple and to sort through and organize all of the outdated and misinformation that's out there. We'll have some scientists, maybe a few MDs, anyone else who might be able to contribute, and we'll also have some chefs come on and share their recipes. So if you have someone in mind that you think would be a good guest, something you want to hear, or you just have any questions, feel free to email me at any time. It's lowoxalatekitchen@gmail.com. So I remember when I was first told I needed to go on a low oxalate diet, it was after I had my first kidney stone analyzed. The doctor told me that my stones were made from calcium oxalate, and he said, you should start this diet. They handed me a couple-page printout that looked like it hadn't been updated in about 20 years. It had a little bit of information about oxalates, maybe a list of 10 or 15 foods to avoid. So I went home, I stopped eating spinach and peanut butter and chocolate, and thought I was good to go. After a little bit of searching, I learned that things are a little bit more complicated than that, and also that I couldn't really rely on the internet to make sure that the information I was seeing was accurate and actually reflective of the latest research. So the goal here, again, is to clear the waters for people that are just starting out, to make sure we're giving out reliable, up-to-date information for everyone, and also to give a bit more detail for the people who have been trying to figure this out for some time and are at the point that they want to take a deeper dive. So our first guest is Michael Liebman, who has a PhD in human nutrition from Virginia Tech and has been a professor at the University of Wyoming for over 25 years. His research focuses on food oxalate content and the factors that affect bioavailability of dietary oxalate, one of the major areas of emphasis being the effect of oxalate solubility in foods on oxalate absorption and urinary excretion. So in this episode, we talk about the research that he's done, and he gives some recommendations on how you can ingest and absorb less oxalate from the foods that you eat. We do talk about spinach for a few minutes, so don't be alarmed. It just happened to be the example that we use to discuss the importance of cooking methods, water content, portion size, etc. Eating spinach is definitely not recommended if you're going to follow a low oxalate diet. We also talk about steaming foods and its effects on oxalates. What you hear on this topic might be different from what you've read elsewhere. You may be able to tell that I was surprised to hear his thoughts, but after some very careful consideration and a bunch of research after our chat, I was able to get a more clear understanding of what happens in that specific situation and what he meant. So there's going to be a few links to some studies in the show notes that you can look at if you're interested in more on this topic. If you have any questions, feel free to read through those and then let me know. You can reach out anytime, and you can find the show notes at lowoxalatekitchen.com/podcast. Also, this is my first interview and the first time I'm recording myself, which if you've ever done and listened to the recording, you know is the weirdest thing ever. So this isn't the most polished interview you're ever going to hear. No worries though, I definitely do plan on improving and they will get better in the future. So with that being said, please enjoy the very first episode of the podcast with Dr. Michael Liebman. All right, Mike, I think we're all set. Welcome to the Low Oxalate Kitchen Podcast.
Good to be here.
All right. So I want to talk about the factors that affect the oxalate content of foods, also the factors that affect how much oxalate is actually getting absorbed into the body once it's ingested. But let's start at the beginning. Give me a basic rundown. What is oxalate and oxalic acid? Where is it found? What kind of foods? And then we'll go from there.
Okay. Oxalate or oxalic acid, and pretty much the terms are used interchangeably, are very similar structurally. It's just a matter of whether the acid form has lost a hydrogen or two, and then it's called oxalate. So for all practical purposes, they're the same compound. The key food sources would be various plant foods, such as fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, and legumes. Very little oxalate or oxalic acid is present in animal foods.
Okay, so that would include meat and also milk, dairy products, eggs.
Right. Eggs, meat, fish, poultry, all dairy products pretty much have very, very low amounts, if any.
Okay. unless there's something added to one of the milk products. 'Cause I do see some yogurts sometimes that have like some stuff in them that can, raise the oxalate level. So that is one thing to watch out for. But in general, they don't have
In
it.
general, yeah, correct.
Okay. All right. So, and then there's a lot of factors that affect the oxalate content of foods. There's, the species of the food, there's the soil conditions, there's how mature it is, which part of the plant or the grain that you're using. So if you were going to try and explain all this to someone, where would you start?
Well, it's somewhat hard to generalize, but one of the reasons why people sometimes see conflicting data between different tables could be because of those factors that you mentioned. It could be different species, the plants could have been harvested at different times, different maturity. Not so much the parts of the plant, although it can differ quite a bit between the stems and the leaves, but that's usually indicated, or it's fairly obvious in terms of what food. I'm not sure that answered everything you had asked.
Yeah, just in general, if you were gonna try and touch on, all of the different factors, what would you say maybe is the most important factor to consider?
Well, certainly the food that we're dealing with, whether it's a high oxalate food or a low oxalate food, but what people really need to realize is that the amount consumed is critical. In other words, the serving size. You can have a high oxalate spice. For example, turmeric is very, very high, cinnamon is very, very high, and a lot of times we express oxalate per 100 grams. But when you think about how much turmeric you're going to add in a recipe or how much cinnamon you're going to use, it could be well less than 1 gram. So you've got to consider how much of that food you're consuming. And this is very true with supplements. Most supplements aren't particularly high in oxalate, but there are a few that are. But when you think about that little capsule that constitutes a serving size, lots of times it's only a fraction of a gram. So it's very, very unusual for a supplement that you take by capsule or pill to make a significant contribution because the number of grams that you're consuming is so small.
Right. So is that true also for like in the opposite direction where you have to consider the portion size? Maybe if spinach is very high oxalate in general anyway, but if you were to have a normal portion size, but then cook it down, maybe then the oxalate sort of gets more concentrated and that sort of affects the milligrams per 100 grams.
It does. We have to think of the water content of the food that you're consuming. If it's very, very high in water, then usually the oxalate is not particularly concentrated. So, for example, thinking about spinach, if you eat a salad and it happens to have a couple of spinach or maybe 5 or 10 spinach leaves in it, that's still not going to be a whole lot of oxalate compared to, let's say, a half cup or a cup of cooked spinach. Even though there's a lot of water in that cooked spinach, you've taken that raw spinach and concentrated it down, and a half cup or a cup is actually quite a lot. Right. Whereas a half cup of raw spinach is pretty loosely packed and is not all that much. People don't have scales and they don't actually, weigh the foods that they consume, but we can think of things in half cups and that sort of thing.
So you mentioned cooking and, we talk about cooking down spinach and how that affects the oxalate content. Are there any other cooking methods that would affect the oxalate content?
Yeah, I really didn't touch on that in that last question in terms of how cooking can sometimes pull some of the oxalate out. If you boil a food like spinach, a lot of the oxalate is going to leach out from the spinach leaves or leaves and stems into the water. And typically we discard the water. So you've lowered the oxalate content significantly. We've shown in our lab that boiling and throwing out the water is the most effective way to lower oxalate. Steaming is not quite as effective, but will lower oxalate to some extent. And if you use a dry cooking method like baking a food, like thinking of a potato that's baked, you really aren't losing any oxalate at all because there's no opportunity for that oxalate to really leach out. So wet cooking is a lot different from baking or broiling in terms of how it's going to affect the oxalate content of that food.
Okay. What would you say about the difference between maybe sautéing in a pan and also and then steaming? Is there any difference there?
I would say sautéing is likely to be in a small amount of oil, and oxalate is not soluble in fat or oil. So sautéing, unless you're going to add some water at some point and do a combination of oil and water in that pan, you're probably not going to lose any oxalate. Whereas steaming, depending upon the time and depending upon the food that we're talking about, is likely to lower the oxalate to some extent.
Right. And then what about the ratio of soluble to insoluble? How does that sort of come into play here when we're talking about boiling?
Yeah, you're more apt to lose the soluble oxalate content. The solubility issue refers to water solubility. So some foods that are very, very high in soluble oxalate, those are foods that we're likely to see quite a bit of leaching out into the cooking water, more so than the insoluble, although you do lose a little bit of the insoluble oxalate also.
Okay. Does all of the soluble oxalate come out, or is it only a portion?
It depends upon how small you've cut the food into pieces, and it depends upon how long you boil, but it's not likely to be all of the soluble oxalate that you will lose, but you can knock it down a significant portion depending upon how you've cut the vegetable or whatever food we're talking about and whether you've boiled it for a significant period of time. It's always a trade-off with boiling because you're also losing other key nutrients that you would like to not lose, water-soluble vitamins, for example. But sometimes it's more important with a food like spinach to drop that oxalate down.
Right. Okay. Some people might be listening to this and wondering why we're talking about eating spinach, but that was just the example we came up with. And most people probably won't eat spinach. But this is true of any food that has some proportion of the oxalate being soluble, that you can take some out when you do boil it.
Right.
Now, if you start with a food that's really high like spinach and you take a lot of it out with boiling, it still might be very high. So spinach is probably one of those things you want to avoid in general, unless it's just a leaf here and there in a salad, like you said.
Right. If you're trying to strictly adhere to a low oxalate diet, you're not going to want to eat a large serving of spinach.
Right.
Or even probably a moderate serving.
Mm-hmm. Is there any foods that come to mind when you think of where the oxalate is affected, or the oxalate level is affected by how mature the plant is?
The maturity issue in terms of when the plant is harvested is sort of a tricky one. I don't know that we can generalize in terms of how maturity affects oxalate content because research hasn't really looked at that. No studies that I know of have really meticulously assessed that question of maturity. But one thing I can say is that sometimes ripeness of a food can affect the oxalate content. And a really good example of that relates to some work we did with avocados. It appears that when you initially purchase that avocado and it's very, very hard and not ripe at all, it has quite a bit more oxalate than when you bring it home and let it sit and ripen. And if it gets to be to that stage where it's almost too ripe and you catch it right then, it's lost quite a bit of oxalate from that initial level. So ripeness, at least for avocados, does seem to affect the oxalate in a positive way, I guess.
Right. Any idea, I guess, where the oxalate goes or what it kind of converts into?
It's hard to know what it converts into, but there has to be some sort of enzymatic conversion going on along with the ripening process where the oxalate is being broken up or degraded, whatever term you want to use.
Right. And then how much of a factor is the location where the plant is grown? Because I know there's some flowers, like say rye flower, for example, some of them have been tested and had 20 milligrams per 100 grams, and also some are around 50 or 60. So, I mean, that's almost triple the amount. How does the soil conditions or the location that it's grown sort of come into play?
Likely to have some effect. I don't know that it could cause that much of a difference. It might, but there's also the issue of methodological differences in terms of the different kinds of analyses that people are using. Some of the work that was done quite a few years ago, or a number of decades ago, I should say, led to pretty erroneous results. And so some of that difference where you're seeing between tables for the same food, I suspect a lot of that is methodological. Probably couldn't totally be attributed to different soil conditions or different growing conditions.
Maybe something to do with the species of the grain also, because I know there's a million different types of wheat.
Right.
I'm
Sure.
guessing it's the same for rye, or that there's at least a couple of varieties, right?
Yeah, the varieties can differ, but one wouldn't think that they would differ threefold, like between 20 and 50 or 60 milligrams per 100 grams. I suppose it's possible, but usually we see smaller variation between different species.
Okay. There's also which part of the grain is being used also. So a lot of people ask me all the time about bread, and they say, what kind of bread can I have? And unfortunately, the answer is usually white bread, if any, and a smaller amount because wheat is still pretty high in general. But the oxalate is usually concentrated in a certain part of the grain, right?
It tends to be more in the germ and bran fraction of the grain rather than the starchy part. So that's why refining foods, although we like people to consume unrefined foods, it's somewhat the opposite when you're talking about the oxalate content of foods. Oftentimes when you refine, you take off the bran, you take off the fiber fraction on the outside of that wheat kernel, you're taking off the most oxalate-rich part. Unfortunately, you're taking off the most fiber-rich part too.
Right. Yeah, so it's a little trade-off there.
It's a trade-off. Lots of trade-offs when you try to stay on a low oxalate diet.
For sure. All right. So let's move on to the factors affecting absorption of oxalates. Would you say that the most important thing here is the soluble versus insoluble argument?
I think that's a pretty important factor. It's somewhat controversial because not all the studies have been definitive in terms of suggesting that soluble is more absorbable than the insoluble. But the well-designed studies which have compared two foods, one of which has a high proportion of soluble compared to the total versus a low proportion of soluble oxalate compared to the total, have pretty much shown that the soluble fraction is better absorbed than the insoluble fraction. So that's why when we do oxalate analyses these days, we tend to report both the total oxalate content as well as the soluble oxalate content.
Okay.
And so that's one important factor.
Yeah.
Okay.
How do they measure the amount that's being absorbed?
There's a couple of different ways, but typically what you're going to do is have your participants in the study collect urine samples before the high oxalate food is given, and over a timed period, and hopefully, well, not hopefully, but if you do the study well, they haven't consumed high oxalate foods during that period when they're collecting their baseline urine, the urine that is going to contain oxalate that's not from food. Then you give them the high oxalate food and you do timed urine collections afterwards, typically up to about 24 hours. And you look at that urinary oxalate excretion post giving the food compared to before the food was consumed. And there's some formulas and mathematical calculations. With oxalate absorption, you're going to see an increase in urinary oxalate from baseline. And when you look at that increase and you sort of know how much oxalate you gave, you can figure out, or at least approximate, the percent absorption. So that brings up an issue that a lot of people perhaps are not aware of, that even if you consume zero oxalate, not that that's possible because a lot of foods are going to contain a small amount, but if you do that pretty meticulously, you're still going to see oxalate in the urine because of oxalate production within the body. So what I'm indicating is that urine oxalate is a combination of what we call body production, the fancy term for that is endogenous, and oxalate, which is absorbed from the diet. So when you do these sophisticated experiments where you try to figure out oxalate absorption, you have to take into account the endogenous production for a person and see what happens above that. How much more oxalate do you get in the urine after the person has consumed that high oxalate food? Okay. I don't know if that makes any sense. I hope so.
Yeah, sure. So you basically get an endogenous, a measure of the endogenous production beforehand. That's right. the baseline. And then most of the oxalate that you consume after that makes its way out within 24 hours. So you collect that right in the urine.
And then you subtract the endogenous production that you've estimated from the previous urine samples so that you can see how much oxalate is appearing in that urine from that high oxalate food that you fed.
Okay. I think in one of the studies I saw they used cinnamon as one of the foods that has a higher percentage of insoluble oxalates to show that it didn't increase that much. And I forget what the other one was.
The other one was turmeric.
Turmeric? Okay. So that's the one that has a high percentage of soluble oxalate?
Right. So those were two very high oxalate spices that differed dramatically in the soluble compared to insoluble fraction.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And so for people who are listening, that's another reason that you'll see a couple cinnamon teas that are low in oxalate, but cinnamon, as the spice just ground is very high because when you put the tea bag in the water and let it sit, because most of the oxalate is insoluble in cinnamon, it doesn't leach out into the water. So the tea itself will be lower.
Right. And you've also diluted it way, way down compared to the pure cinnamon powder.
Right. There's also the topic of getting calcium in with meals. How does that sort of affect what goes on during absorption?
Yeah, this is something that people have been looking at probably the last 10, 20 years. This ability of calcium taken or consumed during the same meal as oxalate to bond with the oxalate within the gastrointestinal tract. And calcium oxalate, as you may know, forms a very strong bond. So when that happens, it makes that oxalate within the small intestine, for example, not very absorbable because it's tied up with calcium. And if we can get that oxalate to keep on moving through the gastrointestinal tract and out via the fecal route, then we're minimizing the amount of oxalate that gets into the body, that gets into the bloodstream, which then, of course, once it's in the blood, it can be delivered to various places and will eventually be excreted via the urinary system. So a lot of foods that contain oxalate may contain calcium, but what some people do is that they take, when they know they're consuming a high oxalate meal, they may take a calcium supplement to even further decrease that oxalate absorption. Magnesium will also do that to some extent, but it's not as good as calcium in tying it up, so to speak, and reducing its absorption.
Would you recommend the calcium supplements for everyone? Is there only a specific portion of the population that should do that, or is there any guidelines there that you recommend?
Well, calcium supplements have been around a long time, and of course we think about the ability of increasing our calcium intake to have a positive effect on our bones. It really depends upon how much calcium is in your diet already. If you're not consuming foods that have calcium, let's say for whatever reason you don't consume a lot of dairy foods, and you're really wanting to strictly limit the amount of oxalate that gets absorbed, taking 100, 150, 200 milligrams of calcium via a supplement, something like calcium citrate, is probably going to be beneficial. It's unlikely to have negative effects. The recommended amount of calcium that we tend to say to people is something like 800 or 1,000 milligrams a day. Getting 150 or 200 via supplement with a high oxalate meal is very likely to lower that absorption. So it depends how strict you want to be in terms of limiting oxalate absorption into the body.
Right. And that's not sort of a way for people to just consume as much oxalates as they want, as long as they're taking calcium supplements. This is kind of like, if you have a high oxalate meal and you can't really avoid it in that situation, or you just, you're having if you want to call it a cheat meal, I guess. But
right.
If you're having, a meal here and there with a higher oxalate amount and you want to have the supplement, then that's probably the safest way to go and not really rely on it, right?
Right. I would say that most people that are needing to be on a low oxalate diet, their number one thing that they're thinking about when they consume a meal is not to get a whole lot of oxalate, but the calcium supplement could be an adjunct to that. Just a further way to slow down the absorption. It won't take it down to zero. So with a high oxalate meal, you still may get an appreciable amount that's getting in. But people should also realize that the absorption of oxalate is nothing like what we tend to see for some so-called nutrients, like some of the vitamins and minerals that we get in the diet, which we may absorb 30, 40, 50%. It tends to be around 10%. And it can fluctuate around that 10%, depending upon the soluble versus insoluble ratio, the amount of calcium and magnesium that are consumed at that same meal. For some foods, we've seen absorption as low as 2%. And so, again, if you're only absorbing 2% of the oxalate in a meal, it may be a moderate oxalate-containing meal, but when you do the math, not that much is actually getting into the body.
Okay, and that might differ for some people with certain conditions, right? If they have any GI issues.
Sure. Yeah. There's a number of conditions where people will sort of hyperabsorb oxalate, and these are some of the people that tend to be more predisposed to kidney stones. People with fat malabsorption tend to sometimes absorb more oxalate than average. Various gastrointestinal conditions can affect oxalate absorption. So lots of factors that are involved.
Right. So, and going back to the calcium real quick, if you're interested in getting it from whole foods, cheese is one good option. If you have kidney stones, it's a good idea to watch the sodium level when you're eating cheese. I did an article on that a week or two ago. It's on my blog if anybody wants to check it out. But it's kind of like a comparison of the different cheeses and the amount of, or the ratio of calcium to sodium, so you can kind of pick and choose the right ones. There's also chickpeas, black-eyed peas. There's a species of kale called dino kale or Tuscan kale, or I don't know how to say it, lacinato, I guess. I've read it a million times but never actually said it. and also collard greens are some foods that are low in oxalates but also high in calcium, if you want to include those with your meals.
Right. Yeah, those are good recommendations.
So do you know if they've done any studies with calcium supplements that collect urine for 24 hours to make sure that if the calcium is binding the oxalate in the gut and it's taking it further through the GI tract, that it's not getting absorbed later and then excreted via the urine?
Yeah, we've done studies on that where we've used calcium supplements, and we've seen decreases from, say, something like 6 or 7% without the calcium supplement down to 3 or 4%. So it's pretty definitive, I think, when you look at all the research that's been done, that you can get an appreciable decrease, but it doesn't drop it to zero. It just drops 2, 3, 4%, depending upon the high oxalate meal that you're providing or the high oxalate food that you're providing. But
Right.
yeah, we've had people collect urine post consumption of the supplement with the high oxalate food, and we've quantified that oxalate excretion and seen that it is quite a bit lower.
Right. Yeah, there's not a lot of concrete research out there when it comes to oxalates in general, but I think this is one of the things that I found, at least, that everyone sort of agrees on, that getting calcium with the meals can definitely reduce the amount that's absorbed. So that's
Yes, I think that's been pretty well proven.
Yep. All right, cool. So let's talk about probiotics for a second. I've heard that there's a strain of bacteria called, I think it's Oxalobacter formigenes, I guess is how you say it. And it's naturally present in the gut to my understanding, and it helps break down oxalates.
Right. Oxalobacter formigenes.
Formigenes, okay.
It's an interesting bacterium because it uses oxalate as its sole source of energy, so to speak. And for reasons that we don't understand all that well, only a segment of the population seems to be colonized. And what appears to be happening is that during infancy, early childhood, a high percentage of the population is colonized, but something about getting older and getting to an adult, I've seen varying estimates. It could be half the population or somewhere around that is colonized with these bacteria that will degrade oxalate, but it happens past the small intestine in the colon, or also known as the large intestine. So the tricky thing here is that you've already passed what most people consider the primary site of absorption, that being the small intestine. There's a little bit of absorption that occurs in the stomach. So we don't know how important that is. Research has shown that in terms of kidney stone formers, when people have looked at populations of kidney stone formers and done analyses to see if they're colonized with this bacterium, not being colonized has been shown to increase the risk of being a stone former. So actually, those studies looked at populations of both stone formers and non-stone formers. So it's another factor to consider. Even though it's pretty low in the GI tract and it may be past the primary site of absorption, it still has an effect on the amount of oxalate that's likely getting into the system. And oxalate that gets into the system is ultimately excreted in the urine. And if you excrete too much oxalate in the urine, then you are predisposed to kidney stones, and you also are possibly predisposed to a number of other disease disorders where oxalate in the body can have an effect on various tissues that appear to be sensitive to oxalate.
Yeah, I know there's a wide range of people that, are trying to get on this diet, and, for a wide variety of different reasons. So, that's good to know. Is there other kinds of bacteria that use oxalate as a fuel source, or is it just this one strain?
No, there's a number of others. This is probably the Oxalobacter formigenes is probably the most adept, so to speak, at degrading oxalate. But there's a number of lactobacillus species. There's a Streptococcus thermophilus that has also been shown to degrade oxalate. So there's actually quite a few species, and some of these have been tried in probiotics to see if probiotic consumption can alter the composition of the so-called microbiome, which is a fancy way of saying the bacterial population down there in the colon, in a favorable way so that we can get more oxalate degradation and less getting into the system. Unfortunately, when you look at all the evidence from all these studies that use probiotics, we've had some success. I shouldn't say we, although I was involved in one or two of those studies, but not total success. And what we seemed to see is that it was more people who were absorbing too much oxalate, the people that were on the top of the curve in terms of oxalate absorption, because it varies a lot from person to person. They were the people that the probiotics seemed to more likely have an effect in terms of decreasing the amount of oxalate getting into the system. But there is a company, and I'm going to mention their name, Oxthera, and your listeners can Google that and look at their website. They are doing a lot of work with this idea of providing a probiotic preparation that may prove to be effective or more effective in terms of lowering the amount of oxalate that gets into the system. They have a couple of products that are looking quite promising. One of them is called Oxabact, and this contains a number of bacterial species that metabolize or break down oxalate. And what's sort of exciting to me is that this product may be emitting some compounds that cause oxalate to be secreted into the gut from the bloodstream, so to speak. Okay, so there can be a bidirectional flux of oxalate from inside the GI tract into the body, into the blood, but there could also be a significant amount of oxalate being secreted. And if we can increase that secretion of oxalate into the GI tract, that's less oxalate that's going to be in the blood and less oxalate-rich blood that goes through the kidney and gets excreted in the urine. So these products are actually maybe fairly close to being approved. I think the Oxabact is in a phase 3 clinical study, which is pretty far along in the total research tunnel, so to speak. And so they're looking at safety, they're looking at long-term efficacy. It's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. I had heard of Oxabact and I knew it was in the trials. I think it's scheduled to, the phase 3 trial is scheduled to finish either later this year or next year. So hopefully we'll be able to see that soon. But I had no idea that about the bidirectional flow that you were mentioning, that it could go from the bloodstream back into the colon. That's
right.
Really
right.
Interesting.
That's what really makes this more exciting, because one wonders how much, how significant it can be to simply degrade oxalate down in the colon when you've already passed the primary sites of absorption. But if you can get some secretion of oxalate from the bloodstream into the colon, then you're decreasing the amount of oxalate in the body, so to speak, because then it's going to go out via the fecal route.
So while we wait for that to maybe come on the market in the next year or two, maybe, are there any probiotics out there now that you might recommend?
Well, it's hard to recommend something where the evidence is not definitive. But some people have had a little bit of success with a probiotic called VSL number 3. And I don't know if it's whether you have to contact the pharmaceutical company directly to get it. It's VSL Pharmaceuticals, or whether it's over the counter. I don't think it's over the counter. It's used clinically for some very specific gastrointestinal issues, and it's had success. In terms of it being used clinically for kidney stones or other disorders that are related to high oxalate in the body, I think it's been used in a couple of research studies with some success, but not definitive. So it's hard to know whether it's going to be effective. Right. But it does contain a number of species of bacteria that degrade oxalate.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's take some questions from the Facebook group that I have. So I posted a week or two ago that I was going to be interviewing you, and if anyone had any questions for you or anything that they were trying to figure out on their own that they haven't yet, to post them, and we'll see if we can get to any of them. So we do have one about absorption. So do you have any other tips to limit intake or absorption in general? We already talked about calcium. Someone mentioned only brewing tea for a certain amount of time, because the longer you leave it there, then the more oxalate can come out into the water. So just, do you have any other tips in general to limit the intake or absorption of oxalates?
Well, I think we've hit on the major ones. I mean, ensuring that calcium and magnesium, calcium in particular, that you have some intake during that same meal. Cooking, we've touched on that, although we mentioned that that's a trade-off in terms of losing perhaps some significant amounts of some of the water-soluble nutrients if you boil something for a long period of time. I just want to, reemphasize that serving size is critical with these high oxalate foods. A small serving size can still make a fairly small contribution to your total intake. I mean, if you can stay within 50 or 100 milligrams a day, that's still considered fairly low. And if a food, even if it's high oxalate, when we express it per 100 grams and then you only consume 10 grams of it, it can still maybe only be giving you 3, 4, 5, 6 milligrams. So you're going to stay under your target, whether it's a fairly strict target like 50 or a little looser target like 70 or 100. So serving size is critical in terms of the ultimate amount that is going to get into your body.
Yeah, and that's especially true, like you said, for some of the spices. And one of the ones that I looked up before we jumped on the call here is black pepper, which is generally considered to be very, very high oxalate. And that's because it's listed as a tablespoon, which is going to be very, very high. The teaspoon of black pepper is only 12 milligrams of oxalate, according to the spreadsheet that I use. And I'm sure there's very few people who would use even close to a teaspoon or even a half a teaspoon if they were going to add that to their meal.
Right.
So if you're just using a couple sprinkles of black pepper, it's probably okay and only going to add a couple milligrams here and there.
Probably even less, because
even less, yeah.
When you think about, a teaspoon might be, I don't know, black pepper is fairly light, so it's probably only a couple of grams. But when you season your food, you're probably using way less than a gram, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And so even if a food is fairly high per a couple of grams, and you're using a couple of tenths of a gram, perhaps, it could very well be a negligible contribution.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about just meeting general nutrition needs while on a low oxalate diet? Is there anything, you mentioned when you boil some foods that you might be losing a little bit of the good nutrients too, but is there anything that we're inadvertently cutting out when we're focused on cutting out oxalates, or any concerns, just in a sort of holistic nutrition kind of way?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because a lot of the high oxalate foods are very, very nutritious foods that if you're on a strict low oxalate diet, you're probably not going to consume those foods. But if you think about all of the food groups where oxalate is contained, for example, fruits and vegetables, and you have a good comprehensive list of the oxalate content of various fruits and vegetables, there's a number of low oxalate fruits, and there's a number of low oxalate vegetables. For example, among the green leafies, a very, very nutritious grouping of foods, spinach and Swiss chard are extremely high in oxalate, and you would probably limit severely the amount that you take in. But there's other green leafy vegetables like kale and collards that are fairly low in oxalate. So within each food group, if you have good listings and have good data, you can always find foods that are nutritious and are of low oxalate varieties. There are a number of legumes, for example, black beans, that are very, very high in oxalate, but there are also legumes like lentils and split peas and black-eyed peas, for example, that are quite low in oxalate. So within legumes, you can make wise choices. To some extent, you can do the same thing with grains. Unfortunately, a lot of the whole grains are high. So that's one place, I think, where your diet gets a little bit compromised. Even among the nuts, there can be tremendous variation in oxalate levels. For example, almonds, unfortunately, are very, very high in oxalate, but there are a number of nuts and seeds for which the oxalate content is moderate or low. So it's a challenge, I think, if you're on a strict low oxalate diet, but if you have good data and you plan carefully, I think you can still be on a very nutritious diet. And of course, there's no limitation in terms of the other food groups: meat, fish, poultry, eggs, dairy products. I would think it would be way more difficult for a strict vegetarian or a vegan to balance everything out, but it can still be done.
And maybe combining some of those medium range foods, like if you want to have some nuts or some seeds for the nutritional value it brings, maybe not almonds, but the lower range ones or the medium ones. There's pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds if you want to have not a big portion, but a smaller portion of that. And then maybe that's the time to combine it with some calcium while you're taking it in. There's also, like you mentioned, for a lot of the fruits and vegetables, if you can't have the spinach or the chard, there's other leafy greens, and that goes for most of the other vegetables too, except for the grains, like you said. And if you're looking for a simple list of low oxalate vegetables, I do have one on my website. And then there's probably a lot of people wondering, as they're listening to this, if they haven't asked me already, which list I go by. And I use the spreadsheet that the Trying Low Oxalates group on Facebook uses. So if you want access to that, you have to join their group and message one of their moderators. I'm pretty sure that's how they're doing it. They might have set up another subgroup now that you might have to join, but they like to educate people on the topic first before they give them access to this list, because it can be overwhelming because there's so much good information in there. So if people need help reading that, or searching through it, trying to figure it out, you can let me know and I'll help you out. But it is their list and they keep track of it, and they update it regularly. You can submit stuff to them to have it tested. They send out new stuff regularly every 6 months or so. So if you want, you can do that. And you mentioned that the Harvard list is also another one that you think is sort of up to date, because there's a lot of ones that are out there that are just haven't been updated in years and years.
Right. The Harvard one is very reasonable. I mean, it's not perfect. Of course, the VP Foundation also provides their members with good oxalate data. They come out with newsletters periodically that have new oxalate data, and they also published a cookbook in 2005, which sounds like a long time ago, but it has pretty good data in terms of oxalate content of foods also.
All right. And then, so we have another question from the group. Someone asked, how would the absorption of oxalates be affected if you were to get a lot at once, like in one meal, versus spread out throughout the day? So if you were getting, 50 or 100 milligrams in a meal versus spread out throughout the whole day.
Yeah, that's a good question. If it acts like a lot of nutrients, and I suspect it would, then you would get less if it was all consumed at once. A lot of times when you consume a lot of a particular nutrient, we sort of semi-overwhelm the absorptive capacity within the cells where it is absorbed, most of them being in the small intestine. So I would suspect strongly, and I don't know that this has been specifically tested, that spreading it out throughout the day is going to lead to a higher ultimate amount that gets into the body compared to totaling up all that oxalate from those spread out meals and giving it all at once.
Okay. All right. And then the last one I have here is about endogenous production, which we mentioned before. I don't know too much about it, but this would be good for me and also for everyone that's listening. What does it mean really to be an endogenous producer of oxalates? Who is it a concern for, and what can we do if we fall into that category?
Yeah, people can vary a lot in terms of how much oxalate they make within the body. And there are people that have a disorder called primary hyperoxaluria who make or synthesize very, very large amounts. And that affects a very small percent of the population, but that's the worst case scenario in terms of endogenous production. From person to person who people that don't have that genetic disorder where they just overproduce, it can vary a lot. There are certain things that we get in the diet that we all get. For example, we all consume protein, whether it's from animal products or plant products, but some of those amino acids that make up proteins can be converted to oxalate within the body. So that accounts for some proportion of oxalate production. But a real big one that is sort of leads me to a word of caution is vitamin C, also known as ascorbic acid. I think the research is pretty definitive that if you take megadoses of vitamin C, and I'm talking about probably at least 1,000 milligrams, and to put that in perspective, the recommended amount for adults, I think, is 75 for adult women, 90 for adult men. So we're talking about at least 10 times the RDA. Ascorbic acid is a very important precursor of oxalate. So in other words, a portion of that excess ascorbic acid that you consume can be converted to oxalate, making a significant contribution to that endogenous production. So although ascorbic acid is sort of controversial, based on some of the earlier work suggesting that it might help us reduce the incidence or the severity of colds, for people that are concerned about oxalate influx into the body, taking gram doses, 1 gram equals 1,000 milligrams, you probably want to stay away from that.
Right. So that includes probably most multivitamins, maybe not all of them, but I know that a lot of them contain a lot of vitamin C and a lot of the other water soluble vitamins, because they can kind of just put them in there. And, that's that's what makes the urine very, very yellow. If you're taking a multivitamin, it does get absorbed, but then it gets
excreted because you easily exceed the kidney threshold. In other words, you get so much in the blood that you exceed the ability of the kidney to reabsorb it. Yeah, that happens with the water-soluble vitamins. But you have to look at the label. If it's providing 250 milligrams, which is only 2 or 3 times the RDA, you're unlikely to get this effect of having a significant endogenous production from that. Once you get above, it could even be above 500 for some people that are susceptible, but I think more of the research suggests that you got to get up around 1,000 milligrams, which is a gram, to get that effect. So you got to look at the label in terms of those multivitamins.
Yeah, very, very important to learn how to read the labels of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it'll tell you how much ascorbic acid is in each capsule.
Mm-hmm. So as far as the endogenous production goes, you said usually it happens when you have too much either meat or vitamin C. So does that mean, to be an endogenous producer, that like the starting point is really something exogenous, like something that comes in, something that you're eating or something that gets absorbed, and then the production in the body occurs because you are ingesting the precursors?
Yeah, ingesting the precursors, but it's also just an end product of metabolism. So you could avoid the precursors totally, and there's still going to be some endogenous production. Just by virtue of your cells metabolizing various compounds, there's always going to be some oxalate production. I've never heard of anybody who has zero endogenous production. And there was some controversy in the literature early on about what percent of the urinary oxalate was endogenous versus that which came from food. And we used to think that it was mostly endogenous. But work done more recently has suggested that consuming a moderate to high oxalate diet, you can get up to almost close to 50-50 in terms of that urinary oxalate being traced to endogenous production versus that which was absorbed from food. The message here is that some people who happen to be high endogenous producers, and it's of no fault of their own, it's not that they're necessarily over-consuming ascorbic acid, and the connection between high meat consumption, even though that would give you a lot of protein and higher endogenous, has not been proven, even though theoretically we know that we can produce oxalate from amino acids. There's just reasons why some people have a metabolism which creates more of an endogenous oxalate load, and that oxalate is going to get into the blood and eventually be excreted in the urine. So, except for really avoiding megadoses of ascorbate, there's not a whole lot that I think we can do to lower that endogenous production. It's more a matter of just the genes that we have and what our metabolism does.
Okay. So I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. I think we covered most of what we had planned. Is there anything else you think we should mention? Anything you think we left out or didn't go into enough detail on?
I'm looking at these lists of things that I know we were planning to talk about, and I think we hit them all pretty well.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can't think of a whole lot to add at this point.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think this is going to be very helpful for a lot of people. This is going to be episode number 1, I think, of the podcast. So I think it's a really good place for everyone to start and get a better idea of what's going on here. I know the internet doesn't make it easy for people to find organized sources of reliable information, especially about oxalates. So I think this is going to be very helpful for a lot of people.
Good. I hope so.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Vincent.
Hello again, everybody. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for listening. Just a few quick notes before you go. We did talk briefly about if there were any probiotics currently on the market that might be useful in breaking down ingested oxalates, and Dr. Liebman mentioned that VSL number 3 might be helpful in that regard. The current formulation of that probiotic is similar to the original that was used in Dr. Liebman's studies, but as of 2016, I believe it was, the original inventor of that formulation has moved on to a new company called VisBiome, and he's taken the patent for the original formulation with him to this new company. So if you're interested in getting a probiotic, VSL number 3 may still be a good choice, but if you want the original formulation that was used in the studies by Dr. Liebman and his colleagues, that is currently available as VisBiome. So both of these should be available over the counter, but maybe only at certain pharmacies. They are a bit pricey, but it's because they're such high quality and they're really meant for pretty serious health conditions. They should be kept refrigerated, so if you don't see them outside the pharmacy, ask if they're being kept behind the pharmacy counter in a refrigerator. Even though they are kept back there sometimes, you still shouldn't need a prescription. If you can't find them or just want to order them online, there are links in the show notes to each, and you can find those at lowoxalatekitchen.com/podcast. There will also be a link to an article that talks about the difference between VSL number 3 and VisBiome and what happened with that whole situation, if you want to check that out. Thank you so much again for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please do let me know. Send me an email at lowoxalatekitchen@gmail.com. And if you have the time to rate the podcast and leave a review on whichever app you're using to listen, that would be awesome. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, and thank you so much for listening.